In this episode, we're going to take the vague advice to keep systems secure and turn it into a systematic way of thinking about exploit mitigation. Beginners often imagine exploits as rare, genius-level events that you can only stop with advanced tools. But most real-world exploitation succeeds because environments are predictable, inconsistent, and full of unnecessary exposure. Exploit mitigation is the practice of making it harder for attackers to use software flaws to gain control, and it usually works best when it is approached as a routine discipline rather than an emergency response. The three pillars will focus on are hardening, patching, and reducing attack surface, because those are the levers that change the attacker's probability of success. These levers also interact. A patched system still needs hardening. A hardened system still needs patching, and both are more effective when the environment exposes fewer entry points. The goal is to build a clear model that helps you understand why these controls matter, what trade-offs they involve, and how to evaluate whether an organization is doing them in a mature way, even if you are not the person configuring the systems. A good starting point is understanding what an exploit really is in practical terms. An exploit is a method of abusing a vulnerability so that the attacker can make a system do something the designer did not intend, such as running attacker-controlled code, reading protected memory, or bypassing an authentication check. Not every vulnerability is exploitable, and not every exploit leads to full system takeover, but attackers prefer flaws that provide reliable, repeatable leverage. Exploits also have prerequisites, meaning certain conditions must be true, such as a service being reachable, a user being tricked into opening content, or a process running with elevated privileges. This is where defenders gain leverage. If you can remove prerequisites, limit privileges, or introduce protective friction, you can break the exploit chain even if the vulnerability exists. Beginners sometimes assume the only defense is fixing the vulnerability itself, but mitigation is broader than patching. Mitigation is about reducing the chance that a flaw becomes a successful compromise, and it does that by changing the environment the attacker must operate in. Hardening is the set of choices that make a system less permissive, less exposed, and less likely to be abused. A hardened system has fewer unnecessary features enabled, stronger defaults, tighter permissions, and more consistent enforcement of least privilege. Hardening often begins with removing or disabling things that are not needed, because unused features still create potential vulnerabilities and increase complexity. It also includes configuration choices that limit how software behaves, such as restricting what processes can do, limiting access to sensitive files, and enforcing strong authentication for administrative actions. For beginners, the key idea is that most systems ship with general-purpose defaults meant to work everywhere, not with security-optimized defaults for your specific environment. Hardening is the process of reshaping those defaults so the system behaves in a narrower, safer way that matches its intended role. When hardening is neglected, attackers benefit from broad functionality that defenders never intended to rely on. A practical way to understand hardening is to think about reducing unintended pathways. If a server is intended to host one application, then extra services running on that server are unintended pathways for attackers. If an account is intended to read certain files, then write access to other areas is an unintended pathway for attackers. If users should not install arbitrary software, then local administrator privileges become an unintended pathway for attackers. Hardening seeks to remove these unnecessary pathways, because exploitation often turns small footholds into bigger compromises through available options. This is also where the idea of safe defaults matters. When secure settings are the baseline, you reduce reliance on individual users remembering to do the right thing. Hardening is most effective when it is consistent and automated, because manual hardening tends to drift as systems change. For beginners, it is enough to understand that hardening is about narrowing what the system can do and who can do it, which reduces both accidental misbehavior and attacker abuse. Patching is the process of applying updates that fix known vulnerabilities, and it remains one of the most effective exploit mitigations because many attacks target known, already fixed flaws. Attackers often rely on the fact that organizations are slow to patch, especially for systems that are critical, fragile, or difficult to schedule downtime for. This creates a window where the vulnerability is public knowledge and exploit techniques are widely available, but the target remains unpatched. Beginners sometimes assume patching is just routine maintenance, but in security, it is a race against time, because the longer a known vulnerability remains unpatched, the more likely it is to be exploited. Patching also involves prioritization, because not every update is equally urgent, and organizations must decide what to patch first based on exposure and impact. The goal is not to patch everything instantly, but to patch the most dangerous things quickly and to have a reliable cadence that prevents long-term backlog. A mature patch process reduces the attacker's chance of finding a known open door. A common beginner misconception is thinking that patching always means rebooting and breaking systems, which leads to avoidance. In reality, patching can be managed in ways that reduce disruption, such as planned maintenance windows, staged rollouts, and careful testing. The bigger threat is not the inconvenience of patching, but the false sense of stability that comes from avoiding change. Attackers exploit stability when it means unpatched vulnerabilities remain in place for months or years. Another misconception is that patching only matters for operating systems, when in practice applications, libraries, and third-party components are often the easiest targets. Attackers love widely deployed components because one exploit can be reused across many organizations. This is why patching is not just a server team job. It is a full ecosystem discipline that includes endpoints, mobile devices, network equipment, and the software supply chain. For beginners, the key takeaway is that patching is a security control that must be routine and reliable because attackers treat unpatched systems as a predictable resource. Reducing attack surface is the third pillar, and it overlaps with hardening but deserves separate attention because it focuses specifically on exposure and reachable functionality. Attack surface is the set of ways an attacker can interact with a system, including open network services, exposed interfaces, user-facing features, and any input paths that accept data. The larger the attack surface, the more opportunities an attacker has to find vulnerabilities, and the more likely it is that some component is misconfigured or outdated. Attack surface reduction includes limiting which services are accessible from where, turning off unused features, restricting external connectivity, and simplifying architectures so there are fewer moving parts. A beginner-friendly analogy is that every open door, window, and vent is a potential entry point. And even if each one is individually guarded, more openings mean more chances something is left weak. Reducing attack surface is therefore a probability game. Fewer exposures mean fewer opportunities for exploitation. Attack surface reduction also includes limiting privilege and trust relationships, because privilege itself can be an attack surface. If many processes run with high privileges, then any exploit becomes more damaging, because compromise immediately yields powerful access. If systems trust each other broadly, then a compromise in one place can quickly spread. This is why segmentation and least privilege are often described as foundational controls for exploit mitigation. They reduce the paths an attacker can take after the first exploit, which turns a potential enterprise-wide incident into a localized problem. Beginners sometimes think segmentation is only about network design, but it is also about reducing reachable functionality and limiting lateral movement. When you combine segmentation with hardened configurations, you make it harder for attackers to find a direct path to high-value systems. Attack surface is not just about what is visible from the internet. It is about what is visible from any point an attacker might reach. It's also important to understand that exploit mitigation is most effective when it is layered, because attackers adapt. If you rely only on patching, you are vulnerable to unknown vulnerabilities and to the inevitable delay between patch release and patch deployment. If you rely only on hardening, you may still have critical vulnerabilities in exposed services that can be exploited despite good configuration. If you rely only on reducing attack surface, you might still have a single exposed service that becomes a catastrophic point of failure. Layered mitigation means each control compensates for gaps in the others. Hardening reduces the chance a vulnerability can be exploited successfully and reduces impact, if it is. Patching removes known vulnerabilities and shrinks the set of exploitable flaws. Attack surface reduction reduces the number of ways an attacker can reach vulnerabilities in the first place. Together, they change the attacker's economics by raising cost, reducing reliability, and increasing the chance of detection. A common operational pitfall is treating exploit mitigation as a project rather than a process. Organizations might run a hardening effort once, patch aggressively for a few months after an incident, and then drift back into old habits as priorities shift. Attackers thrive on drift because drift recreates predictable weaknesses. Systems get added, new services get enabled, accounts gain privileges, and patch backlogs grow, often without a single dramatic event. A systematic approach builds exploit mitigation into routine operations, such as standard builds that are hardened by default, patch schedules that are tracked and enforced, and continuous review of exposed services. It also means having clear ownership, because if no one owns patching for a component, that component will eventually become the weakest link. Beginners should understand that security is not a one-time state. It is a maintained condition. Exploit mitigation fails when it relies on memory and good intentions rather than on repeatable processes. Another important piece is prioritization based on exposure and impact, because resources are limited and not every risk is equal. A vulnerability in a service that is exposed to the public internet is usually more urgent than a vulnerability in a tool that is accessible only to a small internal group. A vulnerability in a system that holds sensitive data is often more urgent than one in a low-impact system. A vulnerability with reliable exploitation techniques is often more urgent than one that is theoretical or requires unusual conditions. That does not mean internal vulnerabilities can be ignored, because attackers often start inside through phishing and then exploit internal services. It means you need a clear risk language to decide what to fix first and what mitigation can reduce risk while you plan the fix. For beginners, the key lesson is that systematic mitigation is guided by threat reality, not by generic fear. You focus on what is exposed, what is critical, and what is likely to be targeted. Finally, exploit mitigation is deeply connected to detection and response, because even strong prevention will not be perfect. Monitoring for unusual process behavior, unexpected network connections, and abnormal authentication patterns can help detect exploitation attempts early. Response readiness matters because when a vulnerability is actively exploited, organizations may need to deploy emergency mitigations, disable exposed features, or isolate systems while patching. The more prepared an organization is, the less likely a rapid exploit wave will cause chaos. For beginners, it is useful to understand that mitigation is not only about preventing initial compromise. It is also about limiting spread and enabling rapid recovery. An environment with good segmentation, strong identity controls, and reliable backups can withstand exploitation events with less damage than an environment that is flat, over-permissioned, and patch-chaotic. So mitigation and resilience reinforce each other. A systematic approach treats both as part of the same defensive discipline. To close, mitigating exploits systematically means combining hardening, patching, and attack surface reduction into a repeatable operational practice. Hardening narrows system behavior and privileges so vulnerabilities are harder to exploit and less damaging when exploited. Patching removes known vulnerabilities and reduces the pool of exploitable flaws that attackers can rely on. Reducing attack surface limits the ways attackers can reach vulnerable components and limits the paths they can use to spread. The most effective strategy is layered and consistent, because attackers exploit drift, inconsistency, and unnecessary exposure. When organizations treat these controls as ongoing routine disciplines rather than one-time projects, they change the attacker's economics and reduce both the likelihood and the impact of exploitation. This is what it means to move from reactive security to a stable, systematic posture that makes compromise harder, noisier, and less rewarding.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.